Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and Mitzvah Hashem, we will be learning today Daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph and a piece of Nun Gimel Amud Beis as well. As you can tell, I'm constantly trying to make up for some of the ground that we've lost. We lost ground back Pesach time, Shavuos time. Haven't been able to make it up yet, but I'm steadily trying to make up the lost ground to try to get back to the Dirshu schedule, even though we're not that far behind, but I'd like to catch up if we can. At the same time, it happens to be a very, very busy time with a lot of things going on, so it's been a little bit difficult, but we are trying. So, we are still in this very complex Siman in Hilchos Tefillin, Siman Lamed Beis, and we have been covering a lot of the halachos of Safras. We've been talking about the writing of the letters, the writing of the psukim, the writing of the parshios. So we've been really knee-deep in Safras, and today we're going to move on from Safras to the field of a batim macher. We're now going to start to speak about the very complex halachos that pertain to the making of the batim of the Tefillin. So we pick up today on Nun Beis Amud Beis, bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Lamed Zayin. We start off relatively simple. Says the Mechaber, Or habatim tzarech lihiyos me or behema chaya va'oif tahirim. The leather that is used for the manufacture of the batim of the tefillin, they must be made out of the hide of a kosher behema, a kosher animal, for example, a cow, a sheep. Chaya, it could be a kosher chaya, a wild animal, like a deer. Va'oif, or a kosher bird, like a chicken or a duck. Tahirim, they all have to be kosher. However, they don't have to be kosher so that you could eat them. Afilu minavela oitrefa shelahem. We could use the hide of a cow where that cow is not itself kosher la'achila because it's a nevela. It's not a cow that was properly shechted. It was a cow that died. Or we could have a cow that was a treifa. It has a defect, a health defect, that renders it a treifa. So even if we would properly shecht it, it's not a kosher animal. So this animal itself that the hide was taken from is itself not a kosher animal, but it is one of the kosher species of animals. So any cow, any deer, any chicken, whether or not we can actually eat it, but we can use those species. We must use one of those species to for the leather as the source of the leather that we're going to use to construct the batim. Continues the Mechaber on the top of Nun Gimel Amud Aleph. V'rashoy lasois miklaf oy me'or shalil. And you could even use the hide or the klaf, which is only part of the hide. As we've learned already many times, the klaf is one of the splits of the hide. So we could even use the klaf or the hide of a shlil. What's a shlil? A shlil is a fetus. So let's say we had a cow that died and we extracted from the womb of the animal an unborn fetus. We could use that hide as well. And we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah what the novelty, what the chiddush of this halacha is. Let's just take a look here at the Ramah before we dive into the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Ramah, Haga, v'chein haritzuos. So to the straps of the tefillin, the ritzuos, yachal la'asoisan miklaf v'or shlil. You can make them out of the hide of a shlil, out of a fetus. Okay, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah begins on Nun Beis Amud Beis. Near the bottom, Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Kuf Samachet. Or habatim. We're discussing the hide that we're going to use for the manufacture of the batim. V'hu hadin or hatitura v'hama'abarta. When we speak about the construction of the batim, we're talking about the batim, the titura, and the ma'abarta. So let's take out a pair of tefillin over here. Little audio-visual aid always helps. We'll grab a shalosh. So in the parts of the tefillin, we have like this. The cube up here with the shin, right? Let's get that on the camera. You know what? Let's shed a little light on the situation. That might help. Okay, now you can see it a little bit better. So the upper cube over here, this part, which actually contains the parshios, this is what's called the bias itself. Okay, that's the top. If you look at it from a bird's eye view, right, we've got the top, and then we've got this area here that the ritzua passes through, and then we've got this area here that kind of forms the base of the bias. As you can see better in this view, right, it sticks out. So this part is called the actual bias. This part, where the ritzuas pass through this upper area here, when I hold it this way, that's called the ma'abarta, which actually means the pass-through. That's the area that the ritzua passes through. This whole area, kind of the base, the foundation of the bias, this is what's called the titura. I'm not sure if the shirish of the word titura is kind of like yitura, extra, meaning that it's the area that extends beyond the bias itself. It's kind of like an extension of the bias. So the Mishnah Berurah is telling me over here that when we speak about the leather that we're going to use for the bias, and we say that that has to be from a behema chaya or oif tahar, has to be from a kosher species of animal, we're not only referring to the bias itself, we're referring to the ma'abarta, we're referring to the entire titura. It all has to be made out of a behema chaya oif that is tahara. Now, you might wonder, there's a couple of questions that you might have in your mind. One question you might have in your mind right now is, wait a second, Rabbi Weiss, isn't this all one piece of leather? So what are you telling me over here? Obviously, if the bias is made out of a kosher species of animal, and that's the hide that it's made out of, obviously then the ma'abarta and the titura are going to be made out of the same species. But the answer is that no. Really, we're going to see as we continue, technically, most of our batim that we buy nowadays are made me'or echad. They're actually, the entire piece is all made out of one piece of hide. But that's, technically speaking, not really me'ikar adin, a requirement. Really, you could make the bias, the ma'abarta, the titura, out of multiple pieces of hide where they are sewn together. We're also going to learn about the potential for gluing them together. So no, it actually doesn't have to be one piece of hide. And that's why it's necessary for the Mishnah Berurah to tell us that the bias has to be made out of from the hide of a kosher species of animal, so to the titura, so to the ma'avarta. That's one point that I wanted to make. There's another point I wanted to make here. Oh, now it could be that there is a chiddush in that, and the novelty is, why is it that, well, you know what, let's go a little bit further. Why should I preempt what we're going to learn? Let's see the next Mishnah Berurah. So, first of all, again, Mishnah Berurah said, V'huadin arati tura v'ma'abarta, the hide that's used to manufacture the titura and the ma'abarta also have to be the hide of a kosher species of animal. Why, says the Mishnah Berurah, since it is attached in some way, in some manner, it's going to have to be attached to the bias, therefore it has the same din as the bias. Now, where does this halacha, what's the actual source for this halacha? Why is it that you need to use the hide of a kosher species of animal? So for that, let's go to Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Kuf Samach Vav, where the Chavetz Chaim tells us the source is Diksiv, because the pasuk in the Torah HaKadoshah tells us, Laman tihiyat Torahs Hashem beficha. In the context of Tefillin, the Torah HaKadoshah tells us that you have to put on Tefillin. The Rebbeinu Shalom was mitzvah you to put on Tefillin. Why? Laman, in order so that tihiyat Torahs Hashem beficha, the Torah of the Rebbeinu Shalom will be beficha. It will be in your mouth. What does that mean? It means that we put on tefillin as a reminder, as a zecher. And like my Rebbe, one of my Rebbeim, my Manal from my Yeshiva Ketana days, the great Rabbi Elias Schwartz, Zechrein Lavracha, he used to say on the day that a bacher put on tefillin for the first time, he would give him a bracha that the tefillin should go into his mind and into his bloodstream. This is Laman Tiyeh Teres Hashem Beficha. The tefillin, when we put them on, it has an actual effect on us. It imbues us with kedusha. And this is what we see in the pasuk Laman Tiyeh Teres Hashem Beficha. But in the context of our halacha here, that we must use the hide of a kosher species of animal, the Chavetz Chaim says we darshan min hamutar beficha. Gemara in Menachos darshans that it has to be made out of a species of animal that is mutar beficha, that is permissible in your mouth. It has to be something that you're allowed to eat. Now, when we translate this pasuk, what do we see? Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha. It's true that this pasuk is referring to tefillin. If I grab, I have a Tanakh here. If I grab my Tanakh, this is Shmois Yud Gimel Tes. Right here. Okay. It says, that's Bamidbar, not Shmois. It says, V'haya lecha la'os al yadecha. The tefillin should be for an ice on your hand, or lezikarain bein einecha, and as a remembrance between your eyes, leman tihiyeh Toras Hashem beficha, so that the Torah of the Rebbeinu Shalom should be in your mouth. That's what the pasuk says. Now it's true. The pasuk is speaking about tefillin, but if you're going to darshan that it has to be from something that is mutar beficha, why are we darshaning that the tefillin have to be made out of something that's mutar beficha? It says Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha. It's the Torah Kedosha that has to be beficha. So you want to darshan that the klaf that you write Torah on has to be mutar beficha? I understand that. Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha. You want to say that the klaf that you write tefillin on has to be something that's mutar beficha? I understand that too. Because let's remember, what are you writing on the klaf that you put into your tefillin? You're writing psukim from the Torah Kedosha, so that's Torah. So again, I see where you would darshan Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha, that the klaf that you write the psukim on has to be min hamutar beficha. But how do you see that the batim of the tefillin have to be something mutar beficha? So let's continue here in the Mishnah Berurah, where the Mishnah Berurah says, we go now to Nun Gimel Amud Aleph, v'kevan de'ois shin shehu merames al shem shakai. Since we have a shin imprinted, right, pressed in to the batim, right? You see the shin over there on the bias. What is that shin from? That shin is from the Shem Hashem of Shakai. We have the shin, which is pressed into the hide, to the leather of the bias of the Shel Rosh. We have the Dalid that's on the Ritzuas in the Kesher of the Shel Rosh. And then we have a Yud in the Kesher of the Shel Yad that makes up the Shem Shakai, says the Chavetz Chaim. And this is brought down from Gemara in Shabbos Chav Ches Amid Beis. Since the Oish Shin, Shehu Merames al Shem Shakai, Nikmat Ba'ar HaTfilin, is pressed into the leather that the bias is manufactured from, Hu Bechlal Toras Hashem. That is how we know that it has to be min hamutar beficha, because that shin is Torah. It's an ois from the Torah HaKedosha. And since we're pressing in an ois from the Torah HaKedosha onto the leather of the bias, now the drasha of Laman tiyeh Toras Hashem beficha applies to the leather. And again, this comes from a Gemara in Shabbos. If I remember correctly, the Gemara in Shabbos is struggling to figure out. The Gemara says that there's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai that tells us that there's a davar shebikdusha that has to be made out of something that is mutter beficha. And the Gemara is trying to figure out what davar shebekdusha are we speaking about. So one of the possibilities that the Gemara forwards is the possibility that that brisa is talking about the hide of the batim, that it has to be made from something mutter beficha, that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai tells us that. Frek the Gemara, what do you mean? We don't need a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We learn that from a beferish pasuk. What pasuk? Laman tiyeh teres Hashem beficha. How do we learn it out from Laman tiyeh teres Hashem beficha? Says Rashi, because the shin is impressed on the of the bias, and therefore the pasuk of Laman tiyeh teres Hashem beficha applies to the of the batim, and therefore the of the batim must be made out of something that's mutter beficha. Now it's interesting. How do we know that the tefillin shel yad has to be made from something that's mutter beficha? There's no shin on the bias of the shel yad. So how does Laman tiyeh teres Hashem beficha apply to the shel yad? How does Laman tiyeh teres Hashem beficha apply to the ritzuas? So from Rashi, let me see if I think I have Gemara Shabbos here. If I remember correctly, from Rashi, let me see if it was Taka Rashi. Yeah, Rashi says like this: Shin shel tefillin, sheyehei ha'or nikmat mibachot gimel kmotin. Since we know that we have to impress upon the leather of the bias of the shalroish 3 lines, 3 folds to make a shin. V'doime l'shin, so it should be similar to a shin. V'haritzua niksheres kimin dalid. And on the ritzua, we're going to make a kesher that's going to be shaped like a dalid. V'yesh ritzua kefufa kimin yud. Then we take the ritzua of the shalyad and we form a yud out of it. Tahainu shakai. V'kevan da'ois Hashem nichtav b'kvatin shaloi mutter beficha ba'inon umikra nafik. Now again, we're still left with the question of how do you know the shalyad? And I saw an answer to this. I believe the answer that I saw was once we see that the Torah is makbid, that the hide of the roish needs to be mutter beficha and the ritzuas need to be mutter beficha, we extend it to the tefillin shel yad as well. I don't think this was in a Dirshu footnote. Let me take a quick look. Oh, there is Dirshu footnote 203. V'afal pi shebetfillin shel yad ein kosav shin. Even though there is no shin on the shel yad, kosav ha-pri megadim, the pri megadim write shem mikamakim ein lechalek. Nevertheless, we should not make any difference between the shalroish and the shel yad. V'gam tefillin shel yad nichlechu bedin min hamutter beficha mid da'araisa. And even the shel yad is covered by this drasha of min hamutter beficha. V'yichiach ha-bir halacha. And the bir halacha, and that must be what I saw. The bir halacha nun beis amid beis dibur hamaschil tehorim. Yeah, I must have seen it in the bir halacha. It says here in the footnote, v'yichiach bir halacha shu me halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That it's actually that we learn this from a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay, and the Mishnah Berurah concludes over here. Ois katan kuf samach vav. He says it himself. He says, "Vein chiluk ben hashalroish hashalyad." There ultimately is no difference between the shalroish and the shalyad. Now I'll go back to something that I was going to say earlier, when the Mishnah Berurah said that it's not only the bias that has to be made out of a kosher species, but so too the ma'abarta as well as the entire titura. Maybe one of the reasons the Mishnah Berurah needs to tell us is because those don't have a shin. It's only the bias proper that has a shin impressed upon it. So we might have thought that, okay, the bias proper has to be made from the hide of a kosher species, but maybe the ma'abarta and the titura, if we're making them out of a separate piece of hide and we're stitching it to the bias, maybe that could be made out of a behema she'ena tahira. Kamash malan, that no, since you're sewing it or gluing it together to the bias proper, it too has to be min hamutar beficha. Okay, now we go forward. Let's go Nun Gimel Amud Aleph, Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Kuf Samach Zayin. The Mechaber told us V'rashoy lasos miklaf oimei arshel shlil. You're allowed to make the bias out of the klaf, which is a split. It's really the inner split of the hide, or out of the entire hide of a shlil of a fetus. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Kuf Samach Zayin miklaf v'afal pishu hudak. Many of you might be wondering, how are you going to make a bias out of klaf? The klaf is so thin. Yet, it says here that really you could make the batim out of klaf. Shapir mikri ur. Even though it's very, very thin, it is still called ur. It's still called hide. And the requirement that we learn in the Gemara and Menachos is that Tefillin, the batim, must be made out of ur. So, okay, the klaf and the entire hide of a shlil is still called ur. So you're allowed to make a bias out of it. Why would you think you can't? Well, one reason is because since it's so thin, it would be very, very easy for it to become perforated, right? One small knack, and you can have a hole in the hide. And we're going to learn later that a hole in the bias renders the bias possible. So we would think maybe you can't make a bias out of such thin material. Kamash balan that you can. Shlil, we're talking about the klaf or the hide of a fetus, and says the Mishnah Berurah that the novelty, the chiddush over here, where the Mechaber felt he had to tell us that you could use the hide of a fetus is the gam oiroi nikra oir, because like I just said, there's a requirement that you have to use oir. Now there's reason to think that the hide of a fetus is not called oir. Why would you think that? Because in the context of the halachos of Toma and Tahira, we find that the hide of a fetus is not considered ur. It's not considered hide. It's considered a meichel. It's considered basar. It's considered flesh. How do we see that in the halachos of Toma and Tahira? Because the hide of an animal is not mekabel tumas oichlim. It can't be mekabel tuma as a meichel, as a food item, because the hide of an animal is not a food item. It's not edible. You don't eat the hide. But the hide of a fetus is a meichel, and it is mekabel tumas oichlim. Why is that? Because the hide of a fetus is rach. It's very soft. It's dak. It's very thin. Therefore, it's edible. And since it's edible, it's mekamas tumas oichlim. So what do we see? We see that in the context of Tum and Tahara, the oir of a shlil is not called oir. So maybe it's not called oir in the context of Hilchos Tefillin. Kamash malan that it is. Mikam makaim loigara me oir oif. The Mishnah Berurah tells us the raya to this is because we know, and this is from a Beferish Gemara Shabbos Kuf Ches Amud Aleph, the Gemara in Shemona Shratzim tells us that you're allowed to manufacture batim out of the ur, out of the skin or the hide of an oif, of fowl. So, technically speaking, you could make batim out of the skin of a chicken. I'm not sure how you would do it, but you could make batim out of the skin of a chicken, if you could figure out how to do so. Now, the skin of a chicken is definitely a meichel. I know there's a lot of very health-conscious people out there who don't want to eat it because of the cholesterol content, but be that as it may, it's definitely a meichel, and it's definitely mekabel tumas oichlim. Yet the Gemara in Shemona Shratzim says beferish that you're allowed to use the ur of an oif to make batim. So if you're allowed to use the ur of an oif, says the Mishnah Berurah, you're certainly allowed to use the ur of a shlil. Okay. Ois cotton kuf samach tes. The Ramah said that the ritzuas also are supposed to be made. You're also allowed to make the ritzuas out of either the klaf or the hide of a shlil. La'asaisan miklaf, says the Mishnah Berurah right away. He jumps in, rak sheyashchirem. However, we must remember that if we're going to make the ritzuas out of klaf, we must remember to blacken them. The ritzuas shchayrais halacha l'Moshe misinai, because the requirement for ritzuas to be black is a halacha l'Moshe misinai. Okay, now we continue with the Mechaber's second line down, a little bit past the middle of the line. Says the Mechaber, Tzarech sheyihiyeh me'ubed lishmoi. the hide that you're going to use for the manufacture of the batim, they need to be mu'ubad, they need to be tanned lishmoi. It has to be done l'shem kedushas mitzvahs tefillin. So when you go to do the tanning on the hide of the animal for the purposes of using them for the batim of tefillin, when you take the leather, when you take the hide, and you put it into the tanning solution in the vat, you have to say l'shem kedushas mitzvahs tefillin. It has to be mu'ubad lishmoi. And now the Mechaber closes off Sif Lamed Zayin with a very interesting phrase. And he says, Heicha de'efsher. When it's possible. When it's possible, it should be Ba'obad Lishmai. So what do we see right away? We see that the Mechaber holds that this requirement of Ibud Lishmai on the leather is not Me'ikar Adin. It's not a strict requirement. It's Heicha de'efsher, when you can. So let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah and see what's at play. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Kof Ayin Ma'ubid Lishmai. The tanning is supposed to be done Lishmai. Ve'im ha'ibud hayarak l'ritzuas. Let's say you did the tanning Lishmai, but you didn't do it L'shem Kedushas Tefillin. You didn't do it L'shem Kedushas the batim of the Tefillin. You did it L'shem Kedushas Ritzuas of Tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not enough. Loi mahani lahabatim, you cannot use that hide for the batim. Why? The kedushasan chamura, because the kedusha of the batim is elevated over the kedusha of the ritzuas. The batim that hold the parshios, those have a higher level of kedusha than the ritzuas do. So if you did ibud lishmai for ritzuas, that doesn't help for batim. So, truth is that I said that you have to say L'shem Kedushas Mitzvahs Tefillin. If to look into it, it could be you have to say L'shem Kedushas the batim of the Tefillin. Now, if you did it L'shem Kedushas batim, and then you want to use it for Ritzuas, that would be okay. Because now you're taking it a step down, that would be okay. But if you did it for Ritzuas, you cannot use them for the batim. Now, here, a nice Katan Kof Ayin Aleph, the Mechaber said that this halacha that you need ibud lishmai is heicha de'efsher, when it's possible. What's at play over here? Why is it only necessary heicha de'efsher? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ki Rambam, the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillin Perek Gimel Halacha Tezvav, he says, Svirale, the Rambam holds, the loiboi klal ibud ar habatim. The Rambam says a very interesting thing. He says, actually, you don't need tanned leather. You don't have to do ibud on the hide at all in order to use it for tefillin. Who said you need ibud? Just take the hide the way it is and use it for tefillin. The Adarabba, the Rambam says quite the opposite. Yoiser chazaku kishaloi nisabed. He says that the leather is actually stronger if you do not do ibud on it. Part of what the ibud does to the hide is it actually softens up the hide. So don't do ibud on it, and it will be actually stronger, and it'll be better able to resist wear and tear, and be better able to resist getting a nekev, getting a perforation that could potentially render the bias puzzle. Now, if it doesn't need ibud, if ibud is not a requirement, then ibud lishma can't be a requirement. You only need lishma when the step that you're doing is a necessary step. If it's a step that's necessary in the preparation of the davar shebikdusha, right? So let's say you're making tzitzits, we need shazira, so you need shazira lishma. You need the knots, so when you make the knots, you have to do it l'shem kedushas mitzvahs tzitzits. When you write the parsha, you have to write it l'shem kedushas tefillin. But if it's not a necessary step, you don't even need the step at all. So how can you say that you need it done l'shmai? Like the Mishnah Berurah says, Mishamachi kasher afilu ar she'einu mu'ubed klal. Even if the leather wasn't mu'ubed at all, it's kasher. V'choshkein d'loiboi ibud l'shma. Certainly, if you don't need the ibud at all, you can't tell me that you need ibud l'shma. So that's the sheet of the Rambam. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'roiv ha'poskim cholkim alav. The majority of the poskim disagree with the Rambam. Umetzarchi ibud, and they do require ibud. V'gam lishma, and they also require lishma. Upasak al Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch over here is paskening teheicha de efsher by lishma. When it's possible, what does that mean? When it's possible, when you have the ability to make tefillin out of leather that was mu'ubed, then you should make it out of leather that's mu'ubed lishmai. That's the way tefillin should be made. It should be ar mu'ubed, it should be tanned leather, and the ibud should be done lishmai. But if you can't, but when it's not possible, but if you cannot find leather that was mu'ubed l'shem kedushas mitzvahs tefillin, so then you could be samech on the Rambam, milehispatel mitzvahs tefillin. Better to rely on the Rambam and use leather that was not mu'ubed, or was not mu'ubed l'shmai, either one. It's better to rely on the Rambam and use that, and not to be bavatal the mitzvah of tefillin. But my ikar adin, we go like Roiv Paiskim, who say you do need ibud, and since you need ibud, the ibud must be done l'shmai. Let's say you couldn't find, so you used ara that was not mu'ubed, or ara that was not mu'ubed l'shmai, and you put them on, right? Mutar l'smai chal divrei Rambam, so you put them on. But if then you come across tefillin that are mu'ubed and they're mu'ubed l'shmai, yignais habatim elu. You should take these batim that were made out of ar that's not mu'ubed, or ar that's not mu'ubed l'shmai, and you should put them in geniza, put them in shemus. V'yasem ar mu'ubed l'shma, and make batim out of the hides that were mu'ubed l'shma. The Achrayim disagree. When you're stuck and you only have these tefillin that were made out of ar that's not mu'ubed or not mu'ubed l'shmai, and you're putting them on and you're being samech on the Rambam, should you make a bracha or not? So the Mishnah Berurah says over there we have a difference of opinion amongst the Achrayim. We find that the Birkei Yosef agrees to the sheet of the Magen Avram that you could put them on with a bracha. Fa'ayin bebiar halacha, he sends us to the biar halacha for a lengthier discussion on this point. Okay, let's go a little bit weiter. Sif Lamed Ches, bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch here in Gimel Lamed Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Yaseh arba batim. When we're talking about the shalrosh, we should make the shalrosh out of 4 individual batim, right? Let's remember, the shalrosh contains 4 individual parshiyos, each one written on a separate piece of cloth. I don't have, the truth is, tomorrow, Mirz Hashem, I could bring upstairs over here. I do have here in the house tefillin that are opened. On the interior of the tefillin shalrosh, you could see that there are 4 individual compartments. So says the Mechaber, Yasa arba batim, you should make 4 individual compartments, me'or echad, from one piece of hide. So the 4 compartments have to be formed out of one piece of leather, out of one piece of hide. We're not taking one piece of ar and making one compartment, then fashioning a second compartment out of another piece of ar, a third compartment out of another piece of ar, a fourth compartment out of another piece of ar, and then sticking them together. No, we have one piece of leather and we fashion it into 4 compartments. So Yasar ba batime ar echad l'shalrosh. For the shalrosh, we fashion a bias that has 4 individual separate compartments out of one piece of leather. Ubayis echad l'shalyad, and for the shalyad we fashion a bias, a box that has one internal compartment, interior compartment. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Kofayin Beis, back on Nun Gimel Amud Aleph, the bottom line. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Me'or echad. We said that you got to make the bias out of one piece of or. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Vakatichos or tefurim yachad. Let's say you had multiple pieces of hide that you stitched together. Mitzadei the Magen Avram takes the position Tachashuvim ka'or echad. If you took individual pieces of hide and you sewed them together, and now you fashion a bias out of these multiple pieces of hide that are stitched together, chashuvim ka'ar echad, that meets the requirement of the mechaber over here in Sif Lamed Ches, who says that you need ar echad. You need one piece of hide. V'chei kasa b'tshuvas chsam sofer arachayim siman hey. The chsam sofer in the tshuva writes the same thing. Sheyesh lahakel b'tefuros. That we could be makel when it comes to multiple pieces of ar stitched together, that it has a din of an ar echad. But let's say we have multiple pieces of leather that we glued together. We didn't stitch it together, we glued it together. Machmir sham. Chsam sofer is machmir in the case of devek. If you take multiple pieces of a hide and you stitch them together, then the Chasam Sofer agrees that we could be makel and we consider that ar echad. And you can make a bias out of that. But if you take different pieces of ar and you glue them together, on that the Chasam Sofer is machmir and says that is not considered ar echad. However, the Chayadam mashma implies that glued together also makes it an ar echad. V'chein mashma ba'ar zerua, and so it is implied from the words of the ar zerua. V'chein nispashet ata haminig b'medinaisenu, and the Chavetz Chaim says that in his regions, in his medinais, I guess in Poland, this is the way they were noyig. They were noyig to make the bias out of multiple pieces of ar stitched together, or even glued together. They used devek, and they were makel. They held that that's considered ar echad. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, umikamakim, nevertheless, lechatchila roi v'nachayin la'asoisai me ar echad mamish. Lechatchila, the Chavetz Chaim says, it is roi, it is worthy, v'nachayin, and proper, la'asoisai me ar echad mamish, that the bias should actually be made out of one piece of hide. It should not be multiple pieces, not glued together, not sewn together, and you'll see advertised when you go to buy Tefillin, or echad mu'ubid l'shmoi. It's made out of one piece of leather, and the ibud was done l'shmoi. And the Mishnah Berurah continues, and he says, why should you be makpid on this? Ki yesh machmirin, because there are those that are machmir, they rule stringently, v'sovereign, and they hold, that no, that you can't use different pieces sewn together or glued together. They're machmir, and they hold that stitching or gluing does not make ar echad. And the requirement of the mechaber is ar echad. So again, let's just wrap our heads around this. The mechaber is very clear. The mechaber says that the batim of the tefillin have to be made may ar echad. Nobody disputes that. At least not in here. The question is, what does that mean, ar echad? Does it mean it must be one piece of hide? Or could we take multiple pieces of hide and stitch them together? So when it comes to stitching them together, the Mishnah Berurah told us that the Magen Avram says that's okay. The Chsam Sofer says that's okay. How about glue? Could you glue it together? Does that make ar echad? Chsam Sofer is machmir. Chsam Sofer says, nope, he doesn't like glue. The Chayadam says devek is okay. He says the ar zerua is mashma, that devek is okay. He says the minik in his medinas, the Chavetz Chaim, was that devek was okay. But roi v'nachayin, that we should mamish make it may ar echad, not stitched, not glued. Why? Because there are those that are machmir and say that that does not make ar echad, not gluing, not stitching. So we should be machmir, we should use mamish ar echad. Okay, now let's go weiter in Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah says, V'ayin b'chayadam. Now take a look at the chayadam. Now let's wrap our head, let's be clear here. The chayadam is talking about a bias that was made out of different pieces of leather that were glued together. And we just brought down from the Chayadam that the Chavetz Chaim says the Chayadam is mashma, that's okay. The Chayadam is mashma, that if you have different pieces of leather, you glued them together, you could make a bias out of that piece of material, and that's called Ar Echad. And now the Chayadam continues, and says the Chavetz Chaim, V'ayin b'Chayadam, take a look at the Chayadam, Dal kol panim, at least, if you're going to make a bias, this is very important, if you're going to make a bias out of a piece of material, which is a piece of a piece of leather, that's multiple pieces of leather glued together, al kol panim tzrichin sheyu ahabar batim prudois zemizeh v'lo yiu medubakin. If you're gonna make a shel yad, a shel rosh, where all this whole piece of leather is not actually one piece of leather, it's multiple pieces of leather glued together. Now you're taking it and you're forming it into 4 compartments. Now, you want the bias to look nice, right? This looks, you see it's all closed, right? You see the lines over there that delineate, you see the 4 separate batim? It's all tight, it's all closed, it's nice, it's square, it's merubah the way it's supposed to be. That's the way you want it to be, right? You don't want the 4 batim, the 4 compartments to spread apart. Let's remember, like we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah soon, these aren't just lines that were cut in here for a decoration. There are walls inside here separating each one of these compartments. So really, you could, if I took this and I took a plier and I put it here, and I took a plier and I put it here, I could pull this apart. And we're going to see 4 separate batim, 4 separate compartments. We don't want that, right? We want it nice and stuck together. Says the Chayadam, if you made this bias out of multiple pieces of leather glued together, then make sure when you press the arba batim together, do not put glue, do not put devek between the walls of the individual compartments and then press it closed and allow the glue to keep it closed. Do not do that. Why? Let's take a look. Very interesting. So again, says the Chayadam, Dal kol panim tzrichin sheyu arba batim prudoi zemizeh, the 4 batim should be separate. That doesn't mean that you should actually separate them and you should wear the tefillin spread apart. You can't do that because now it's not going to be merubah. So when he says it should be prudois, separate, it just means that they should be physically separate, that there shouldn't be glue sticking them together. V'lo yiu medubakin, they shouldn't be glued together. V'lo k'mo she'oisen ha'soifrim, don't do what the batim machers do, says the Chavetz Chaim, she'medapkin ha'yidei devek, that they glue it together. And then rak shelamala oisid simanim k'mo chritz ba'alma, and then they just scratch out lines up here to delineate 4 compartments. No, don't do that. Make sure it's actually physically 4 separate compartments. Why? Because if we're talking about a bias where it's made out of a piece of material that is multiple pieces of leather glued together, then you went ahead and you fashioned 4 compartments, and then you glued the 4 compartments together, that might be puzzle even b'di'evet. Why? The Mamanavshach. Because how are we going to look at this? Im anu chayshvin ayidei dibuk ar echad. We know that there's a requirement that the bias has to be made out of ar echad. Now, your piece of material is not one piece of leather. It's multiple pieces of leather glued together. Now, you want to go with the shita, with the Chayadam, let's say that that's kosher. Why is it kosher? Oh, because by virtue of the fact that we glued the pieces together, we now look at it as or echad. So what does that mean? That means that glue makes it into one piece. But then you went ahead and you glued the individual 4 compartments together. Well, if you glued the individual 4 compartments together, then it's not 4 compartments. Then the whole thing is one compartment that has interior walls dividing it into 4 sections. But it's not 4 batim, it's 1 bias. And what we need is 4 batim. So you hear what the Chavetz Chaim is saying? He's saying the problem is, Mamanashach, Do you hold that glue makes Ar Echad? If glue makes Ar Echad, so then you will Makayim the requirement of the Mechaber that the bias has to be made out of Ar Echad. Because even though you made out of multiple pieces of leather, but you glued them together, so it's Ar Echad. But then you went ahead and you took the 4 individual batim and you glued those together. Well, if you glued those together, then it's not 4 batim. It's 1 bias, and you need 4 batim. So Memonushach, im aru chayshvena yedei dibuk Ar Echad, if devek makes it Ar Echad, im kein ein lanu ela bias hakas ubesaycha arba bechitzas taposel. Then we don't have 4 individual batim. We have 1 bias that has interior walls that make 4 compartments. And that's puzzle. Vim ein hadevek oisa Ar Echad, and if glue does not make Ar Echad, so the batim are 4 individual batim, but then the bias isn't made out of Ar Echad, because we're talking about a bias that was made out of individual pieces of leather that were glued together. Then you aren't Mekayim Ar Echad. So Memonushach, you're not Yotza. Either you don't have Ar Echad, or you don't have Daled batim, so you can't do it. Well, be'emes, and the truth is, says the Chavetz Chaim, Toivu sha'afilu ha'oisin my Ar Echad mamish. Now the Mishnah Berurah says, even like us, where 99% of us, the batim machers, make the batim out of Ar Echad mamish, not, a piece of material that's made out of multiple pieces of leather glued together. Our batim are really Ar Echad. It's really 1 piece of hide. Still, you Tefillin and Perudais, the Mishnah Berurah says, still, we should not glue the individual batim together to Shem Hadibuk Chibur. Because maybe the halacha is like the shita that says that the glue really makes a chibur. And then if we glue it together, so now it's not daled batim, now it's bias echad. V'chein ha-tefillin shel ha-gra hayu prudais. Chavetz Chaim says that the gra's tefillin were not glued together. It brought down that the Shagas Aryeh's tefillin were not glued together. Vayin b'biur halacha, he sends us to the biur halacha. Now, there are those that say that even if you're not going to glue the individual batim together all the way up in the height of the batim, you should at least put devek down near the titura on the bottom, because otherwise, over time, over the years, the individual batim will spread apart and you'll lose the ribua. But exactly what the batim machers do nowadays is beyond the scope, really, of the shear. But at least now, when you go to buy tefillin for your bar mitzvah bacher or for yourself, and you go to the batim macher and he asks you, do you want devek or not, you'll know what we're talking about. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Next time we'll continue with Siman Lamed Tes, but at least we made a little headway here on the Gimel Lamed Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Shem should said, Yeshua Sefuas Parnasset Sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the BS Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu, amen. Be well.